it's one of the most vulnerable things we can do is say, hey, something I hold really dear, something that I've built an identity upon, maybe it's wrong, right? To even acknowledge that is very, very challenging. But we have really fascinating research where, like, physicians, working physicians, made very different recommendations on whether someone should get surgery, depending on whether the surgery was framed as being 90% chance of survival or a 10% chance of mortality, right? Same exact things, but physicians were making very different decisions based on how it was framed.
Tat, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm doing well, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, do you want to do a quick intro for the people, kind of who you are and what you do, and then we'll hop into the question from the last guest, as all the people listening know, and then we'll just hop into your story and kind of what it is that you're doing.
Sure, I'll be as brief as possible, and then we can dive a little bit deeper into it if you want to. My real name is JonRobert Tartaglione. No one calls me. Everyone calls me Tat. You're welcome to call me Tat as well. I'm a psychologist and behavioral scientist by training. Just finished my Ph.D. and basically I run a consulting practice called Influence 51, where I teach leaders at organizations how they can use psychology and behavioral science to be more effective at what they do.
Very nice. Very, very succinct. I like it. So the question from the last guest is, what song or album changed your life or helped you through a tough period?
Oh, that is tough for me. I I only really listen to music when I'm working out. Like I know some people have different kind of relationships with music. Some people listen to it all the time. Some people have music for different moods. I am strictly a functional music listener. Like I go to the gym and I put on like 90% rap music and like 10% like Disney cover songs. Like for like seriously, like
Yeah.
Disney like
No, I
theme
know.
songs like Mulan. Like I was listening to that in the gym today. Like I'll make a man out of you.
Hmm.
Banger in the gym. So I don't know if there's a song that's really gotten me through a tough time. I can tell you two songs that are my absolute favorites, and they're very different genres.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Okay, so apologies for this maybe not being a satisfactory answer because it's a very nice question. But two songs I really love: Meek Mill, "Dreams and Nightmares."
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one.
One of my top songs of all times. Got played at my wedding. My friends knew this was gonna want to come out. Not the most festive song for a wedding. I can't help
No,
myself.
not really.
The other one, interestingly enough, I mentioned like Disney movies and like a Goofy movie, okay, has one of the best Disney soundtracks of all time because it was headlined by Tevin Campbell. Okay, there are two songs that by Tevin Campbell that are absolutely incredible in the film. Stand Out and Eye to Eye. So you can make an argument for either one of those being your top. For whatever reason, I have a soft spot for Eye to Eye by Tevin Campbell from the Goofy movie soundtrack. It is an incredible song. I can't help but sing along when it comes on.
Fair enough. That's a really good
Yeah.
answer, to be honest. The guy that asked Peter Barber, he's a professional opera singer and also kind of does stuff in the indie kind of YouTube music world.
Yeah.
He asked me, he was like, "Do you have an answer to that? Like, do you think that this was a reasonable question?" I was like, "Oh,
Yeah.
Peter, who cares? We'll ask it anyways." And it's like, so no,
It's,
it's
I think it's
perfect.
a reasonable question. I think many people would have better answers than I do, but I think it's a totally reasonable question.
Yeah, no, 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 100%. I completely agree. So let's start with, I was looking through your LinkedIn and your resume and kind of the things that you've got going on. And to me, at least, there's not really a, I mean, there's a clear path to you because you did it. But it seems like to maybe the person that's not familiar with you that
Yeah.
you've bounced around a little bit.
Yeah.
So can you talk through some of the things that basically your path into how you got, because you were working in for Congress for a little bit and then you're doing stuff in the States and now you're in not in the States anymore. Um, can you talk through kind of a little bit of your path and how you ended up even with the idea to start a business on this, or was this a more recent one, or was the
Yeah.
psychology degree? Just like talk through the journey until you're like, okay, you know what, I'm going to start my own thing and it's going to be this.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Happy to do that. So basically, I guess my parents. always instilled like the importance of education. So neither of my parents have a college degree. Now, I think there's a challenge because some people conflate education with intelligence. That's not necessarily true, right? My parents are incredibly intelligent people, some of the most brilliant people I know, but they never got a college degree, and that can be a barrier, especially when they were growing up. That could be a barrier at times, and so they really wanted me to get a college degree. So. I went to a school called American University for my undergrad and finished at American University. And it was kind of like the dog who finally caught the mailman, right? Like this was the goal, and I did it. And I was like, now what? I had no idea what I wanted to do next. I really didn't know what to do after getting the degree. Getting the degree was the goal. And so I had a period for at least 6 months after graduating where I felt really lost and really aimless. All my friends, had jobs lined up and they kind of jumped into their careers, and I just wasn't prepared. I kind of just wasn't ready, and so I spent a good amount of time trying to figure out like what am I passionate about? What do I want to learn about? And so. Um, I'm not super proud of this, but I wasn't a big reader in college. I didn't read any book cover to cover. I kind of did what I needed to do to get the classwork done. But I actually became a reader. I started kind of picking up books and reading. And fortunately, one of the first books I picked up was a book by Elliot Aronson called The Social Animal. There's a book by David Brooks by the same name, which I'm sure is very good as well. But Elliot Aronson's The Social Animal is widely considered to be like the Bible for social psychology. So it was the first book I ever read on psychology, and I fell in love. I was like, this is fascinating. I was a philosophy major in undergrad, and a lot of philosophy is talking about like theories of human nature, and this was more the empirical side, right? Like what we know about what makes people tick, and so became a voracious reader of psychology books and was like, I want to study psychology in a more formal way. And so went and got a master's at University College London in social cognition. Went and got another master's because I love debt at the University of Chicago in the social sciences. And finally, the reason I ended up coming to the UK or coming back to the UK is had an opportunity to do a PhD at the University of Cambridge, studying political psychology. So how liberals and conservatives think differently, process information differently, are persuaded differently. And basically, what ended up happening is after the first master's degree, I was like, you know what? Like, I find this content fascinating. These different insights about how people think, how they make decisions, what impacts, how they behave. I wanted to see if other professionals understood this thing and how they can apply it to their own professional domain. So I basically called up a few of my friends who were in different arenas. I called up a friend who was just in the corporate space. I said, hey, did they teach you guys about the psychology of persuasive communication? And they're like, well, kind of, but not formally, right? And I called up someone who works in politics. I said, do they teach you guys about how liberals and conservatives think differently from a psychological standpoint? They're like, no, it's something you kind of learn on the job. We don't really get formally taught it. Called up a friend who was in the nonprofit space. Do they teach you about the psychology of fundraising, why people give, what makes them want to give? And the answer to all of them was kind of like, we learn on the job, but we're not really integrating like academic insights on these things. And so that was the birth of Influence 51. I said, you know what? I want to bring these insights, which have these immense value, I want to bring them to individuals that could use them to be better at what they do. And I think that's kind of what Influence 51 strives to do is like take these academic insights that people think are like really dense or really hard to digest. And I want to make them digestible, applicable, palatable for novice audiences.
That makes total sense. And I think to your point, as you were saying, hey, have you ever been taught this? In
Yeah,
my
yeah,
head, the answer was also no. It's like
exactly.
so um I want to touch base a little bit on. So I think when we talked on the phone, one of the questions that you said that you get often that is maybe a misnomer is like, oh, you can teach people how to like influence other people. And I was like, oh yeah, I could see why you would get that question. Um, but at the same time, you do talk about influence a lot. Also, it's more than half of the name of your of your company.
Yeah.
So what when you go into a seminar or workshop or
Mhm.
whatever, and people have this idea that you are going to teach them how to influence people. They're kind of not wrong, but it's not really a full interpretation or a full grasping of what it is that you do. So if you were to go to a workshop for, we'll say in the political realm or maybe a corporate realm or whatever, how does
Mhm.
that work? Do they have a like a set thing like, hey, we want to get our managers better at this, or do you have a like framework that you use that you kind of
Yeah.
take everywhere, or both?
Yeah, so I'll answer it in two parts because I think there's two questions here, each of which is certainly worthwhile to kind of go over in a little bit of detail. So the first one, uh, I think, so I certainly do teach people about influence. That really is the core of what I do. I think the question I get asked that I know we kind of discussed a little bit, right, is a lot of people will come up to me and be like, "Oh, so you're a master manipulator, right? Like isn't that what you do? Do you teach people like manipulation tactics?" And that I take issue with, right? Because there is a very big difference between being able to communicate effectively in a way that might stand a chance of actually changing someone's mind or changing their perspective and trying to manipulate them, right? Manipulation involves coercion. It involves either kind of lying or distorting the facts, or it involves kind of, trying to pressure someone into doing something. Both of which, not only am I vehemently against, but both of which actually we see in the academic literature are counterproductive when it comes to trying to change someone's mind. Okay. So first of all, you want to be honest with individuals. It's not about lying. A lot of what, influence is when it comes to like strategic or persuasive communication, it's about being able to frame things or present ideas in ways that people haven't considered before, right? To be able to kind of get them to take a perspective that they just hadn't really fully considered, right? And so you don't want to lie. You don't want to kind of, manipulate them. You do want to kind of encourage them to think about things in ways they haven't thought about them before, right? Um, the second thing, this idea of like pressuring someone. This again is kind of a fundamental misunderstanding about something like persuasion. So we have a lot of research on persuasion, on attitude change. And it's really interesting because when you ask people like how they persuade someone, or if they were going to try to persuade someone, how do you do it? A lot of people conceptualize persuasion as like a battle of ideas, right? Like if I can create a good enough argument, it's going to defeat your argument and it's going to force you to kind of take my side. But that's not really how persuasion works. And so later on, if you want, we can get into concepts like psychological reactance. Basically, when people are pushed to try to do something, they tend to push back. But more than that, we have a lot of research to show that really it's rarely, if I was trying to change your mind, it's rarely things that I say that are going to be the primary catalyst for your attitude change. Really, it's going to be you that changes your own mind, right? I'm kind of just planting the seed. And the only way I can effectively plant a seed that you're not going to like push out of your mind immediately is if I approach you with respect. I give you your autonomy, your freedom, your space to consider it without me forcing you. And so I do take issue with the idea of like manipulation being what I do. What I do is I teach people how to do things that they want to do and they do all the time: persuasion, influence, attitude change, behavior change. And I show them what the research shows us about how to do that well, right? So that's number one. Number two, in terms of like, well, clients come to me like, do I have something prescriptive or do I have kind of respond to like their needs? It can be both. So from a prescriptive standpoint, I developed influence is this really multifaceted concept. It's super complex and there's a lot of different layers to it. And so I had to come up with a way to make it really accessible for people who aren't academics. And so I have what I call my five principles of influence. And these are like, if someone wanted a crash course and like the five most important things to understand about how people think, how they make decisions, how they behave, these would be the five things. And so if a client comes to me and they're like, we just want to start somewhere, that's where I would tell them to start. Most clients come to me with ideas of what they want, right? So leadership clients will come to me and say, hey, we want to learn about the psychology of motivation. Political clients want to learn about the psychology of persuasive communication. I have legal clients that come to me and they want to understand about juror decision making, right? How do juries make decisions? How can we create better stories? I even have medical clients who want to understand, how do I communicate with my patients to make it more likely that they stick to their routines, that they adopt a healthier lifestyle. And so it's all the same concepts, right? How do you change attitudes, decisions, behaviors? But it's applied to these different contexts based on kind of what people are doing.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And a couple thoughts on what you said to the medical point. I just had a neurosurgeon on the show, and I asked him basically something similar to what you just mentioned, which is you've got to go from operating on somebody's brain to then if they
Mm.
don't make it, you got to go talk to the family. Like, do people teach you how to navigate that, or
Mm.
how to help your own brain go from very stressful to warm and empathy right away? And he was like, well, no, not really. And I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then the second thing that I mentioned when you talk about framing things, well,
Mm.
you talked about persuading people by treating them with respect. I was listening to John Kiriakou, he's a CIA kind of whistleblower, I guess,
Mm.
who was on Rogan. He was talking about when they brought people to interrogate them, that FBI, he had this one example, guy from the FBI treated the guy with respect. He's like, "Hey, do you want a coffee? Blah blah blah. Like you can write a letter to your wife."
Yeah.
And eventually, guy starts to talk, and
Yeah.
then there's a political kind of struggle. CIA takes it over, and they do. And I don't think this is controversial to say at this point, but they've got the torture thing in
Yeah.
Guantanamo, and then all of a sudden he clams up again, and it's like that. What you said
It's a really good
basically
example.
like embodies that or shows that almost exactly.
Yeah.
And then it took the FBI guy like 6 months to get him to open up again. And it's like,
Yeah.
dude, which I mean, in its own way is a little bit alarming, but it's a different discussion for a different day.
That's a good
Um,
example.
yeah, 100%. And then the third piece of or third thought that I have was when you're talking about you got to just plant the seed, but you
Mm.
have to frame it in a way that makes them consider the information
Yeah.
in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. That
Mm.
was basically the quote that somebody told me that made me want to start the podcast in the first place.
Really?
Yeah, because I was having several friends kind of become very politically active either way, and some of it was maybe justified, others was
Mm.
going too far in certain aspects, and it's like, hey man, why are you yelling at this person on Facebook? Like, have you considered XYZ?
Yeah.
And I mean, and you know this from having political clients, it's very, very difficult if somebody's entrenched to kind of
Yeah.
even like to even plant the seed in the first place, because oftentimes that idea is just warded away with like, nope, that idea is radioactive. I don't want to touch that idea. Like, I'm not going to even listen.
Yeah.
And so I was able to do that with a few people, and one of them was like, hey, you made me consider this idea in a way that I hadn't thought about before because of how
Great.
you framed it. Have you thought about starting the podcast? And that was like
Yeah.
back when we started. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's very interesting the way that ideas can be framed.
Mm.
And I think the better you are at, well, one, you have to have a full understanding of the idea to
Mhm.
explain it in different ways. And I think that's also very interesting because especially when you go into the political sphere, and others really, but the political one in particular, where you see the rise of these like debate shows that are
Yeah.
on the internet, and oftentimes one or both of the people debating don't really have, they've got an understanding that is built on like boilerplates and like the headline statistics, and they don't have a real understanding of the idea. And oftentimes those people get nowhere.
Mm.
But it's still interesting to me that those become kind of the most watched.
Yeah.
Like Piers Morgan's show is a complete train wreck almost every time, but it does crazy numbers.
Yeah.
And I don't really understand why that is, because it's not very productive at all
Mm.
usually. I mean, it's great for clicks, I guess, but like why is that? I don't really understand that.
Mm. I, for me, I think it's one of those things when you look at like political media consumption or partisan media consumption. A lot of uh, there's a lot of debate in the academic literature about whether individuals are polarized by the media or if they kind of are already polarized and they're simply choosing the media that tends to echo what they already believe. Um, and there's decent arguments for both sides, but I do think, a lot of it is people want two things, right? They want entertainment and they want to hear that their ideas are good ideas. And I think, when these debate shows you reference, you kind of get both of those things where you get the opportunity to watch two people scream at each other back and forth, which people find that, dramatic and entertaining. And you get at least one of them who is going to be saying exactly what you think and exactly what you feel, which is reassuring for you, right? It feels good to hear someone who knows what they're doing and be able to point and laugh at the person who doesn't know anything or is foolish or naive or whatever it may be. And so I think, it's unfortunate that that's the discourse that tends to sell because it's not the discourse that's probably going to feed, a healthy political ecosystem. But I think it's one of those things where you do have to contend with that from a societal perspective, the difference between kind of what people want, what they crave, and what maybe they need or deserve from a standpoint of actually educating them.
Yeah, I want to go into this a little bit further because when we talk about a healthy society, and for example, if you go back into some of at least in the US, for people listening who are not in the US, but at least in the US, that one of the big principles is that you need an informed populace if this kind of freedom, self-governance thing is going to work. Um, and we see that kind of there's two problems with that at the moment. One is there's so much information that it's difficult to sift through. And even if you do, you can go on one news channel and they have a completely different interpretation of the same event as the other news channel.
Mm.
And so picking out which one is actually the truth can be difficult. And then the second kind of piece to that is social media, and people have gotten so wrapped up in scrolling through, like you've heard the term doom scrolling.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, you people have gotten so wrapped up in that and other things that are going on in their life that they also don't have time to pay
yeah.
attention to all the things that are going on. And when they do, they wade into basically a cesspool of absolute nonsense. And it's like the first reaction, at least that I can tell from
Mm.
people that I've talked to, is like, yeah, they wade into the cesspool of news, and the first reaction is like, I don't even know what's going on, so
Mm.
I'm just going to leave.
Yeah.
And the other one is people get very entrenched, and
Mm.
neither of those are particularly helpful.
Mm.
So if you were to maybe give some tips, tricks, etc., for navigating that within maybe the immediate social circle, like for
Mm.
example, the holidays, people, the joke is at the Thanksgiving table, people get into debates and whatever. Like, what would be some things that you would say with a lens towards maybe a healthier society, getting people back to speaking more civilly,
Mm.
things like that, but within, like with a lens towards that, but within a place where you can actually enact some kind of like neither you nor I is going to go talk at the White House and talk to the
Sure.
whole world, right? But like if everybody does their little part,
Mm.
that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. From a micro standpoint, right? When you're having a conversation, so let's start off just talking about the importance of where conversations take place, right? Because so much of the vitriolic kind of discourse that we see is fueled by the fact that the majority of times is taking place in a public forum, right? And that becomes a challenge because there's a social element to that, where individuals are hesitant to acknowledge when someone else makes a good point because they don't want to look like a bad group member, right? They want to make sure that they're representing their tribe well. They don't want to feel like if they say, "Hey, that's actually a really good point" by someone on the other side, that they're going to be ousted, that they're going to be ostracized. And so these kind of social ecosystems are probably the worst place you could host something like a debate or a conversation when you're looking to change minds, because there is a fear of social isolation, social ostracism from your group, your tribe, if you are to kind of do something that's civil, right? Like saying, "Hey, good point you made." And so the first thing is that there actually is a lot of value if you want to change someone's mind in being able to have a more private, intimate conversation. You eliminate or at least reduce that fear of like the social commitments I have to my group, to being a good group member. Okay. So that would be the first thing. The second thing, and this is, I talked about kind of the five principles, of influence that I like to discuss. Principle number four is that our approach matters, right? And so this is really, really important. So I like to think about someone else's mind, right? If let's say you and I completely disagreed on something, I tell my clients to think about someone else's mind as private property, right? And what I mean by that is imagine that you are sitting in your front yard and you're gardening, right? You're working in your garden, you're planting some flowers. And I walk by and I'm holding the most beautiful plant you've ever seen, right? But without asking, I jump your fence, I barge through, I run to the other side of your garden, I start trying to plant this. What's the first thing you're going to do?
Probably not be very happy and
Be very
hit you with a shovel or something. I
hit me
don't
with
know.
a shovel, get me off your property, right? You're going to respond with defensiveness, likely some aggression, right? And it's not that you didn't like what I was bringing. I had it was the most beautiful plant you've ever seen. But the way I tried to bring it on naturally made you push back, okay? It's the same thing with ideas. When you approach someone saying, I'm going to prove to you why what you're saying is wrong or what you think is stupid, okay? You've immediately created a situation where they can't admit to being wrong without feeling stupid, without feeling like gotcha, right? So you've created a situation where they're not there to listen, they're there to defend, okay? In the same way that they would push you off their property. However, if you can create a situation, if you can create a situation or a space for individuals where you make clear to them that, hey, I'm not trying to make you look foolish. I'm not trying to make you look stupid. I'm not even trying to say that what I'm saying is 100% right. But I want to hear what you think. I want to hear why you think it. I want to kind of talk through my own thoughts and maybe why I think them, right? You create this sense of a genuine conversation where I don't have to worry about defending myself lest I look stupid, right? This is where change happens because change is vulnerable. It's one of the most vulnerable things we can do is say, hey, something I hold really dear, something that I've built an identity upon, maybe it's wrong, right? To even acknowledge that is very, very challenging, and it creates, I mean, it necessitates creating the right space for it. And so approach is really, really important. And then beyond approach, there are little kind of techniques we can use. And again, this is kind of sifting through the academic literature when we kind of look at like how do we actually change people's minds. One of the more interesting ones, and one of the ones I think is useful in the type of situation that you're painting for us, um, is there's a concept known as the illusion of explanatory depth. Okay. So basically, there was some studies that were done. The first one was done back in, I want to say 2002, but it's been replicated over and over now, where they started off and they asked participants, do you know how a zipper works? Do you know how a toilet flush works? All these different things. And of course, if I'm the participant, my immediate response is like, yeah, of course I know how that works, right? I use them all the time. I kind of have an idea of how it works. So they would rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how much they know about how that thing works. Then what they do is they say, we want you to go now in as much detail as possible, step by step, walk us through how this works, right? So now I have to sit down and I have to say, okay, well, a zipper, there's like little teeth and they interlock and there's like fabric holding them together. But of course, the question is like, okay, but how do they make the teeth? What are the shapes of the teeth? How do they interlock? Are they being pushed together? Is it magnetized? Is there a mechanism inside? What prevents them from pulling apart? The point being, right, is after going through this exercise of like, how exactly does this work? You get people getting this kind of having this realization of like, okay, I actually don't understand how much it works. And it promotes what we call intellectual humility, right? This ability to say, like, I actually don't know as much as I thought I knew. What's really interesting about this is that it also tends to work with political issues, right? And so if you're talking to someone, right, you hear all the time, regardless of who's in power, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, you look at something like gas prices and they're like, oh, Biden did this for the gas or Trump's doing this to the gas. And they feel that very strongly. But if you were to ask them, and when I say ask them, again, approach matters here, right? If you were to ask them in a really sassy, kind of condescending way, like, oh, tell me how that works, right? They're going to get defensive and they're not going to learn anything. But if you genuinely say, like, I'm actually unsure about like how, the president's decisions impact gas prices. Can you walk me through that? Right? Because I don't know how it works. They won't know how it works either because truth is it's not a direct thing. It's not like the president says make the gas this. There's a variety of very, very complex socioeconomic and geopolitical things that take place that cause these things to rise and fall. But the point is we've done research on this too, and the same exact process promotes not only intellectual humility when it comes to political issues, but also promotes more moderation in their stances, right? Once people realize that they don't understand these things as much as they think and they feel they do, they also realize that people can be reasonable, right? They also realize if I don't understand it that well, maybe my opinion shouldn't be so strong. And so there's a few different kind of components we can use here, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, that's great. I love the garden analogy. I think it really illustrates that for um well for me and hopefully for people listening. I The intellectual humility thing is something that I don't know if I would say I necessarily work hard on, but it's part of my approach. Well, one to doing this, which is intellectually like all the time people know things that I have no idea. But also just that's how I treat every conversation I go into, which is this person knows something that I don't know, and it makes it a lot less the stakes are a lot less high because I don't feel like I need to know what is going on
Yeah.
with this person. And oftentimes then my first reaction will be like, okay, this person said a thing, and I'll file it away and like go look it up later or whatever. And there's no kind of reaction
Yeah.
to it in that way. Um, but to kind of take this scenario that we've or that I've created a step further, I think often, well, there's 2 points. One is the intellectual humility point where something will happen in the world and then you'll see a tweet that's like, oh, everyone's an economic expert now. It's like, no, they're actually not, but everyone has an opinion. Um, but to kind of take it a step further, we often see that people are living in kind of almost borderline two different realities
Yeah.
where you might say, okay, well, I read this about that, and the answer you get back is, well, that's not true.
Mm.
And that's a tough one to kind of navigate or to bridge that gap there because if I believe that the sky is green and you believe that the sky is blue, like there's not like how do you go with that part? And that's the part I think where I would say people who are not um communicating in a forum like this one, like I can kind of navigate to a certain extent, but that's because I do this all the time and I'm a little bit nuts, and so I talk with people all the time, right? And maybe other people are like, hey, you should stop doing that. It's like, okay, well, anyways, but I think that's the piece that a lot of people get very frustrated by or turned off by because it's rather difficult to say I know this to be true, and somebody say, nope, that's not true. And you're like, but I read it from like 17 different people, and so that's so how would you go about that part as well?
That is I'm going to answer this question in probably a way that's going to add complication more than reduce it.
Sure,
But I
the
think
more
it's
the
it's
merrier.
I think it's probably important. So first of all, obviously I think a lot of people can resonate with the picture you're painting here, in the sense that if we can't agree on basic facts, it's very hard to have an argument, and I think or a productive one at the very least. And I think this is the again, the kind of philosophy undergrad, right? So much of philosophy is about defining key terms, right? When you say, for instance, is something an effective policy? Well, what do we mean by effective, right? And effective for whom? Right? And effective at what times, right? Is it only effective, if it's effective 100% of the time? Is it effective if it's effective during, key moments? Is it effective if it works for the majority of the population? Is it only effective if it works for the point being, right? Is like something as simple as effective, you really need to parse apart like what you mean by that, right? It's hard to have a productive argument because a lot of times we can't agree on facts, we can't agree on how to define terms, and these are really the cornerstones of being able to have a productive conversation. Now, it's sad, I'm gonna add a little bit of complexity here. And so when it comes to political disagreements, it gets even more complex. And the reason is I make this argument that there are some unspoken but fundamental beliefs that liberals and conservatives often disagree about. And the challenge is because they're unspoken, they often don't realize that like this is what is creating this divergence in opinions because we never explicitly address it. And so I'll talk really quickly about the three kind of unspoken fundamental beliefs that often kind of create this divergence without us realizing it. So the first one is a difference in how they see the world. And what I mean by that, right, is if I were to ask you, is the world fundamentally kind of a dangerous and competitive place? Or is it fundamentally a more cooperative and kind of, maybe not safe, but at least benign place? And we find that liberals and conservatives tend to disagree on this. Not all of them share this opinion, but conservatives tend to see the world as a bit more dangerous and competitive, whereas liberals tend to see the world as a bit more cooperative and benign. And this, in and of itself, can create disagreements on the same exact policy. You look at something like border security, right? If I'm someone who sees the world as inherently dangerous and competitive, I see open borders as a threat, right? Whereas if I'm someone who sees the world as cooperative and but relatively benign or not dangerous at the very least, I see open borders as an opportunity, right? And so just the mere fact of not seeing eye to eye on kind of what inherently the world is creates divergence, right? So that's number one, is like what type of world do we live in? The second kind of unspoken disagreement is what is human nature, right? Now, my favorite kind of theory around this, or the way it was articulated at the very least. Thomas Sowell has this really interesting thing where he talks about the constrained view and the unconstrained view of human nature, right? And so he makes this argument that the constrained view of human nature is that humans are inherently flawed, right? There's good and bad, and you can't really change that. And more than that, some people are better than others, and some people aren't as good as others, right? And so there's kind of this inherent imperfection in human nature. We can't really change it. It's just something we have to deal with. There's the unconstrained view of human nature, which is this belief that human nature is pretty good, but more importantly, it's improvable, right? People can be made better. People can be improved upon. The level of good and bad that we see in a society or even see in an individual person is not fixed. It's something that can be changed, right? Now, conservatives, again, this isn't kind of a hard and fast rule, but conservatives tend to believe more than liberals at least in the constrained view of human nature, right? That some people are just better than others, some people aren't as good as others, and there's like these flaws in human nature that we just have to deal with. Whereas liberals tend to see the more unconstrained view, and you can see again just by looking at these two divergent views on human nature, you look at something like social reform programs, right? Conservatives are going to look at them and say, hey, listen, we can't change people. Some people just aren't as good as others. There's just a certain level of good and bad in the world. And so social reform policies are wasteful. They're overly optimistic and naive. Whereas if you believe that human nature is malleable, that it can be improved, Well, then social reform policies are necessary. It would be cruel not to use these because we can make people better, right? So, number two, disagreements on kind of what fundamentally human nature is. Number three is disagreements on how we define right and wrong, good and bad, right? These are kind of moral disagreements. And there's a bunch of different research about kind of where we can go with this. I'll touch on a few kind of prominent theories. We can go into depth if we want to later, but Ronnie Janov Bullman has this really interesting view that there's a difference between proscriptive and prescriptive morality, right? She argues that conservatives tend to support proscriptive morality, which is basically it relies more on kind of preventing bad things from happening, right? Whereas liberals tend to be more about prescriptive morality, right? It's about encouraging people to do good things, right? And so, two different ideas about kind of how you approach what is good and bad. You have people like Dan Megan, who argue that liberals and conservatives have different, what he calls injustice detectors, right? He says that liberals tend to be more sensitive to need, right? We see, so I happen to be a pretty liberal individual naturally. We see someone in need and we want to fix that. We want to help that, right? Whereas conservatives tend to be more sensitive, their injustice detectors are more sensitive to deservingness, right? They want to understand, is what's happening deserved or undeserved, right? And so if we look at something like seeing a homeless person, right? My inclination is this is a person in need, I want to help them. A more conservative individual might say, hey, listen, does this person deserve to be in this situation because of what they've done? Or is this undeserving, right? Before they go and help someone. And so there's different injustice detectors. Another one is, which is probably the most kind of popular and most debated, is what's called moral foundations theory. Jonathan Haidt has this argument that human beings are born with five moral foundations, which is basically things that we can base moral decisions on. Very briefly, he says harm and fairness. So, harm, fairness, authority, loyalty, and purity. And basically, what we find in the literature is that liberal morality tends to rely very heavily on the first two, harm and fairness. Meaning, when I'm trying to decide whether something is right or wrong as a liberal, I tend to ask myself, is anyone being harmed? And is it fair or unfair? Conservatives also consider harm and fairness, but they also give almost equal weight to authority, right? Is what's happening obeying or disobeying authority? Loyalty, is this act loyal or disloyal to my group? And purity, would this act make something impure that shouldn't be made impure, right? And so, again, these ideas of right or wrong, how we define right and wrong, good and bad, also are kind of very different from each group, but we don't often speak about them. They just drive our decisions without us realizing it.
I have a lot of thoughts on a lot of things that you said.
Let's go through it.
The first, well, the first one, I think, well, there's this one's maybe more of a quick one,
Yeah,
then I think we can maybe navigate off of the scenario that we painted earlier, which
sure.
is if you find yourself in a situation where you're in this scenario,
Hmm.
and you mentioned right defining terms. I watched one of the Jubilee debates. I don't know if you're familiar with those. It's like the 20 versus one. So they'll have somebody who is um an expert or something on some subject, and then they'll like cast 20 kind of normal people, and they all get to go debate them for like a couple minutes, and it's fairly entertaining. And if it's done well, then I think it's really beneficial. Obviously,
Yeah.
some are not done so well. Anyways, but what this person did, the one in the like the subject of the debate started off every person as defining the key terms of the
Hmm.
claim and whatever else. And
Smart.
I would urge people, if they find themselves in the situation, to not get bogged down in the minutia of, because it's very easy to say, okay, I'm going to use the term um, effective,
Hmm.
and you can argue for an hour about what effective really means,
Hmm.
and that might be a good thing to get your term straight, but like that's not. the point of what it is that you're talking about. And so I would urge people to kind of keep that in mind where a consensus of like a pretty good definition for a word like effective or something like that is better than not if you are actually interested in getting to the bottom of whatever it is that you're discussing. So I just leave that there. I don't know if you agree with that or not, but um,
I think so. I don't. I agree with the spirit of what you're saying, right? That if
yes,
we want to kind of get to the heart of the conversations, then we don't want to spend, hours and hours defining our terms, right? Because that kind of detracts from it. I do think that there are going to be times where you're probably going to have to pause a conversation that isn't going anywhere, that's completely gridlocked, and
of
say,
course.
hey, can we talk about what do you mean when you talk about effective? Because oftentimes it might be that, hey, it's not necessarily that we can't agree on this, it's that we're debating two separate things because our definition is different.
100%. I don't disagree with that either. But I
Yeah.
think there was a memo from I think it was CIA that came out in terms of like when they're influencing governments or sending agents in to like slow things down. And one of the things on to like basically sabotage from the inside out is to excessively ask for clarification and definitions and to slow things down. And that's one of the things where you can really derail a discussion by like, well, what do you mean by this? And what do you mean by that? And are you sure you mean this by that? And it's like you can completely derail the I think generally speaking we agree. But anyways, the other thought that I had is we've seen kind of this resurgence in, I think, religion in the last maybe 2 years
Mm,
specifically. And to your point about the morality of right and wrong, um, I think we saw. Well, actually, okay. So let me try. There's two concepts, and maybe I can weave them together, but I don't know. So I'll just throw them both out there. First one is kind of a level of toxic empathy where you can feel so much for, or you can try to feel so much like that this person's lot in life isn't fair,
mm,
that maybe I like we see this with kind of the term that's often thrown out there is like the victim Olympics.
mm,
And it's like, okay, empathy is, I think you want to understand where people are coming from, but to what extent does that actually influence actions and what kind of actions does that therefore influence? Um, because especially in the political realm where you've got your local constituents and then you've got maybe your state and then you've got your country and there's
mm,
different levels that you have to balance and doing enacting a policy because you feel for one person maybe is not the best solution for the group as a whole.
mm,
And then the second part, the religion part, is I've seen this a lot. I think it's much more open than it was even like 2, 3 years ago. And that to me is very interesting because I think there's a lot of people who feel there's a level of, I guess I'll just say evil in the world that the only place to go, this is my interpretation. I was just thinking of this as you were talking, where
mm,
I think people had a fairly good kind of compass about, okay, well, yeah, you shouldn't steal that. But then there were laws that were like, okay, well, like in California, if it wasn't $1,000 worth of stuff, then it's okay
mm,
because the guy's homeless and we feel sorry for him. And I think people struggled using that as the example, struggled to grapple with like, yeah, but that's a small business and that guy worked his butt off to open the store and it's now just okay to steal $999 worth of things.
mm,
Like that doesn't make any sense. But also, I don't want the guy to be homeless either. And I think people were struggling to grapple with that because it's very conflicting.
mm.
Um, and I don't know if in your kind of experience or whatever that you've seen that as well the last couple of years. I don't know. Well, I guess I'll just leave it there. Like, do you have thoughts on my thoughts, I guess?
I definitely have thoughts on the first one. Empathy is it's a very interesting concept from an academic standpoint. So empathy, it comes from a
Actually,
German.
sorry, can I pause
Yeah,
real quick? I
yeah,
the example to tie those together to the
yeah,
like the $999 thing,
yeah.
the empathy of the homeless person leads you to a policy where you can where that now is okay. And that's the part where it's like, okay, yes, but also that's not good either.
Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, So I'll start with empathy. Empathy, yeah, it comes from a German word that I won't try to pronounce, but right, it means feeling into, right? Empathy is feeling as another person does, experiencing the world as they do. Empathy is really interesting because um, we find that individuals tend to have different levels of kind of state and trait empathy. So trait empathy being kind of the amount of empathy that you're born with, right? This is kind of the your natural levels of empathy or empathic kind of resonance. And then you have state empathy, which is like in a particular context, a particular situation, right? Can you be brought to have more or less empathy based on the circumstances? Um, but there also is pretty interesting research about like the um, well, there's two schools of thought. One school of thought, which I don't think there's very good research for this, or at least I'm not 100% convinced by this, is there's been some research that has suggested that conservatives have less empathy, less trait empathy than liberals do. The other school of thought, which I think I found a bit more compelling, is that it's not necessarily that Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives have different levels of empathy. It's more about their deployment of empathy, okay? Where, and you've kind of hit on this, we could refer to like what we call our circles of concern, right? And if circles of concern would be like, series of like concentric circles, the first one being just yourself, then your immediate family, then your larger family, then your friends, then your community, then the state, the country, the world, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Liberals tend to be very diffuse in how they kind of approach those different levels, right? They tend to want to give as much empathy to someone across the world as they would give to someone in their family or in their community. Conservatives tend to have a more, what we can call parochial empathy, right? They tend to want to focus their empathic concern on their group, on their tribe, right? My family, my friends, my country, my community, right? And others kind of don't fall within that empathic concern as much as these individuals. And so, I think empathy is a really powerful thing. I think it's a really multifaceted and interesting concept to study. But I do think it's important to understand that deployments of empathy can be very, very different. And again, this goes back to like when we talk about like what's the right way to deploy empathy. Well, once again, it goes back to things like worldview and human nature, right? If I believe the world is a really good cooperative place, I should be trying to empathize with everyone, right? Because everyone is a potential cooperation partner. Everyone is someone that I might be able to kind of befriend and build an alliance with. If I believe the world is a dangerous competitive place, well, guess what? I can't be wasting my empathy on people that aren't going to reciprocate that aren't going to be nice to me, that aren't going to empathize back. In that case, I should be focusing my empathy on my family and my community and my country, people I know who are going to empathize with me. And so, again, as with many of these political debates, even though, we all have opinions, it doesn't really come down to right and wrong. It kind of comes down to the underlying assumptions, the underlying beliefs about kind of what the right way to approach these things are and what the wrong way to approach it is. In terms of the kind of policy that you're referencing in California, I'm not really familiar with the policy, but you're saying that there are certain places where they can steal a
Yeah,
certain amount of things?
let me go Google it real quick.
Yeah, sure. I will say, while you're doing,
Okay,
yeah, go
so
ahead.
it says, at least on a quick Google,
Yeah, yeah.
because I remember hearing about this and reading about this. This was kind of during COVID a little bit.
Mhm.
Um, where did it go? Actually, go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
reading through an article to try and get like a summary
So
of
I,
what it
I
is.
think it's interesting. So I think a policy like that. So let's make sure I'm understanding a policy wherein kind of if you steal something that's below a certain threshold, you're not going to be penalized for it, or you're not going to be
Okay,
arrested
so
for it,
what it
or
looks like based on quick Google is that they basically. reclassed like what petty theft meant,
Hmm.
and it used to be more like you used to go to jail for it, and now like it's not really being enforced because instead of it being a felony, it's a misdemeanor, and so the judges aren't really enforcing it as much. So in effect, like I think it looks like
Hmm.
it's still technically illegal, but in effect, it's not being
Gotcha.
really enforced at all. So people are kind of going to jail for a night and then
Gotcha.
getting
Gotcha.
released.
Okay, so I think that's interesting. I think, I think first and foremost, there is a question to be had about like the underlying reason that that policy was enacted. Now, I know you kind of alluded to the fact that maybe it was empathy towards like, homeless people stealing something, and perhaps that is the case.
When
Um,
I mean during BLM and during the like the COVID lockdowns, that was
yeah.
I mean that was the stated was like, oh, like the corporations have all these money, all this money, and so these
Hmm.
people shouldn't go to jail because they need food. Like that was the kind of the underlying like sentiment of whatever, like at the time. And again, this is
Hmm.
like 2, 3 years ago or 3, 4 years ago at this point. So
Yeah.
I don't have it all on recall the same way
Yeah.
I would have if we had this discussion like 3 years ago. But that was, I mean, that was what it was, or at least the vibe that came off from it was like these people don't have things. All the
Hmm.
corporations have things. So like they should be able to have some stuff. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, I mean, yeah, they should have stuff, but also, anyways, keep
Okay,
going.
so I think it's interesting. Again, I would want to understand the underlying rationale because that seems to me like maybe some people were justifying it like that, like creating this kind of post hoc rationalization of why that is. And maybe that is the case. Maybe there's resource constraints, whether it be at the level of the police or the level of the kind of correctional facilities. Maybe it was one of those things where individuals, we can't keep locking these people up or we can't keep trying these people because it's detracting from crimes that we consider more serious, which are getting put on the back burner or we don't have the kind of the space for. So I think it would be first important to kind of understand why that was enacted. That would be my first question. But I think the idea of empathy as it ties to this is an interesting one because I agree with you that, if we were to assume that this was enacted because people kind of felt for, homeless people or struggling people and we don't want to punish them when they're stealing things that are necessities or to feed themselves. Um, that is certainly, an empathic standpoint. And I could see why some individuals who disagreed with that, would kind of try to villainize that sense of empathy, right? Where like empathy there is what you call toxic empathy in a way. I understand that argument. Um, I would make a counter argument, for argument's sake, that potentially it's not that they have an issue with empathy. It's that their empathy is directed elsewhere, right? They look at these kind of small mom and pop shops who are kind of being victimized by these policies, and they have empathy for them. They say, hey, listen, these people don't deserve to have this happening to them, right? I might understand, that we don't want to mistreat homeless people, but we also don't want to mistreat these individuals that have worked hard to build a small business, right? And so it's not necessarily that, it's kind of empathy on the one hand causing something bad, and then there's no empathy on the other side. There is empathy on the other side. It's just directed in a little bit of a different direction.
Is that that seems to be like how much empathy do you have to go around in terms of
It's a good
like
question.
if you have empathy for the whole world, like I feel like that's kind of not super healthy in a way in terms of like I don't know, like I just in terms of I think you should be caring about yourself and your immediate family, and that's how kind of you should be oriented from the standpoint. And again, it goes back to your point about the disagreements on how people lean and see the world and stuff like that. But the people say like control the controllables. Like I
Mm,
can't help the person that's in Central America that needs asylum because of MS-13 violence or whatever. Like I can't help that person. Like realistically. Like
mm,
maybe if I put a an absolute boatload of effort into this one specific person, but then there's more, and am I neglecting my job or my wife or whatever? And it like that trade-off doesn't feel right,
mm.
I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that, right? And I think that the point you're hitting on, right? Like is empathy a finite resource? And if it is a finite resource, right, shouldn't it be directed towards, individuals or causes that I have more control over, that I kind of feel more strongly towards? I think that's a perfectly logical argument. I think a lot of people would certainly side with you on that argument, right? If there are resource constraints, we can't help everyone. I
I
think
mean,
it's
time and money is a resource constraint.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. You can't help everyone, right? So I think that's totally fair. I think um, it does become complicated when you ask, like, you start to differentiate between practicality and principle, right? Like, should I only be helping people that are easier to help, or that are, kind of more convenient to help, or people that kind of look like me, or in my community? That's a more, a kind of a principled debate that I don't think has a clear answer, right? I don't know the answer to that. I can't sit here and say like one thing is right and one thing is wrong. What I can say is it's much easier for me to kind of acknowledge that there are practical constraints to empathy, and we do need to kind of make sure that we understand that, maybe when it comes to time and money and resources, empathy is not something that we can kind of use to, like, we can't fix everything in the world. I do think it's a much more sticky, hairy situation when we talk about kind of who should we be empathizing about, right? Who should we have the most empathy towards? Who should we be directing the most empathy towards? I don't think there's a clean answer to that, but I think that's a much more philosophical question.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. 100%. And I wish, not that there would, I mean, I think there's never going to be a clear answer to that
Yeah.
question, probably, and it is all a little bit subjective, which is kind of where the religion piece was coming in, where it feels like people are like, okay, I don't want to be subjective anymore. I want to ground this in something that if they do believe
Yeah.
in Christianity, for instance, like then all this the Bible becomes objective truth, and so then there's a real grounding in that. I think a big chunk of that was due to kind of recent events in September with the killing of Charlie Kirk,
Mm,
um, but also but also when moral principles are subjective, you
mm,
can go down to a very dark place very quickly.
sure.
Um, and so I think I don't know. I guess this is just what I'm observing, and people started doing some more digging, and there's been kind of, at least in my algorithm, there's been several kind of clips and reels of people saying, okay, well, yeah, all the original state constitutions for the 13 colonies had declarations of faith in them,
Mm,
and it was meant to be kind of in that principled way, built off scripture,
mm.
and I think I'm just seeing more and more of it than I ever have been. And I don't know if that's been your experience as well, or if you have maybe thoughts on that phenomena, if you are also seeing it.
Well, I mean, I think that it is a pretty observable phenomena that when individuals are in fear, they look for greater certainty. And there's perhaps no better apparatus to achieve certainty than religion, right? To be able to kind of seek shelter in this um, the warmth of knowing that, like, these things are happening for a reason, that the world isn't just random, that there's some sort of purpose or divine plan. That's certainly an observable phenomena, right? And so I do not doubt that individuals might be kind of turning to religion, if they do in fact feel that their world is becoming more dangerous or more unpredictable, right? We turn to religion for that predictability. And so I can certainly say that that is an observable phenomena. I don't think I'm the person to make comments about, like, changing the Constitution or anything like that. I am yeah I am a firm believer in the separation of church and state, because I am someone who I, if we say we want religion guiding our principles, of course the next question has to be what religion,
Hmm.
right? Now, many people, when they say that, they want Christianity to guide that. And that is a much different discussion than just having religion in our schools or religion in our government. And so it's a conversation, it's a debate that is beyond my pay grade. It's not something that I can purport to be an expert in. I'm not. I need to know where my expertise starts and ends. Um, I think that it is uh, going to be much more complicated than simply let's start integrating religion into our schools because again we get to that issue with definitions. What do we mean by
Yeah.
religion, right?
No, and I don't think anyone was purporting to add it to the Constitution. I think the claim is that the Constitution was written for a Christian society, not that the government needs to be inherently Christian, if that makes sense.
I actually think that I mean that in and of itself is quite interesting, right? If that is the case, if the founding fathers were writing it for a Christian society, right? A society that was overwhelmingly Christian, and they still
Which it was.
which it was, and they still made the choice, the deliberate choice to say we don't want religion to be in our states and in our schools. That's quite interesting, right?
Hmm.
Because at that point, if you have a more homogenous community from a religious standpoint, it becomes much easier to put those things into the schools. There's going to be much less pushback. So it's quite interesting to think that the founding fathers still found it worthwhile and, in fact, absolutely essential to make sure that these things stayed out of the schools and out of the state legislatures.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think not to read too much into it and completely derail because I want to get to some of the corporate stuff as well. But the way it looks to me, based on reading some of the Federalist Papers and some of the writings of Jefferson and a few of the other stuff, which yes, I know people in the audience, I do these things because I'm crazy. But the way it looked to me was that like the principle of um everyone being on the same moral standing,
Hmm.
um and like the way it was written was kind of under the assumption that people would have the same or a similar view of morals based on
Hmm.
at that time the Bible. However, due to right all the kind of the other freedoms and rights, they did not want any sort of persecution based on religion, et cetera, et
Hmm.
cetera. And so that's where that kind of comes in, that fine line between like, yeah, we want everybody to be following these principles because we think that this is how this form of governance will be successful. But at the same time, if somebody comes here who doesn't practice that, they shouldn't be shunned either.
Hmm.
And I think it's towing that fine line between the two. That's my interpretation, anyways. But again, like you
That's
said,
interesting.
above my pay grade. So okay, let's jump to the corporate stuff because I know you've
Yeah,
got
sure.
not too much time left. Um, what do you find within corporate structures that is the biggest kind of issue? And I'll caveat this with like sometimes I see promotions from people who are very good at what they do, like they're an
Yeah.
engineer, for example, and then they become a manager of engineers, and they're not a good manager, they're a good engineer.
Yeah.
Um, how in a corporate setting would you kind of let me see if I can actually I'll ask it this way.
Yeah.
It's very easy for people to become disillusioned with a 9 to 5 in corporate world.
Yeah.
And so in terms of motivating people or teaching
Hmm.
managers and leaders to actually have people that want to come to work,
Hmm.
specifically in the corporate setting, I think that that has an added difficulty level than maybe a sports team or the military or something else
Hmm.
might be where people actually want to be there.
Hmm.
How do you go about teaching managers and leaders in that sort of setting about maybe culture and motivation and those sorts of things? Because I think there's plenty of people that go read one textbook on leadership and everything they say sounds like it's from that textbook, and you're still like,
Yeah.
yeah, but I still don't really want to listen to you at all.
Yeah.
How do you sort through that, and what are some of the things that you talk to those people about?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll start with culture because um, culture in and of itself, like organizational cultures, is a really interesting concept to talk about, right? So I like when I talk about culture to differentiate it from like the employee handbook, right? The employee handbook is, this thing you're handed on your first day. It has these explicit sets of rules of like, here's how we do things around here. Here's how things work. Here are our processes and procedures. Culture, if you start reading the academic literature on things like culture, right? Culture, you're going to see phrases like unspoken rules, unwritten rules of behavior, right? These are the things that culture kind of picks up where the employee handbook leaves off, right? Culture is what answers the questions that employees have that they're too scared to ask out loud, right? Should I speak up in meetings or should I stay quiet, right? Should I be someone who is more innovative and proactive or should I just be conservative and reactive with things like my ideas, right? Am I going to be rewarded or punished for out of the box thinking? People don't go and look at the employee handbook for these answers because they're not there, right? It's culture that answers these questions. People look around and they kind of feel, they see the type of culture they're in, and that gives them the answers to these questions, right? And it's also important to differentiate culture from, well, before I go on to that, I'll give you a really quick example of like why it's so important. You've probably heard the phrase, right? Culture eats strategy for breakfast or culture eats strategy for lunch. And I'll give you an idea, right, of this distinction between like the employee handbook, these explicit rules, and culture. I want you to imagine that imagine you're working in an office, okay? I don't know if this is your full-time job or if you actually have a job outside of this, right? But imagine you're in an office, you're working on a team with 20 people, let's say. In this hypothetical, right, your team's going to be split in half. 10 people are going to be randomly teleported to a completely different culture that they know nothing about, and 10 people are going to be randomly teleported to another culture that they know nothing about. Okay? They land in this teleportation scenario in this new, completely unfamiliar culture, and both of them see a sign that says, do not litter, right? An explicit set of rules like the employee handbook that says, do not litter. But the first group ends up in a culture that is absolutely covered in trash all over it, right? The other one ends up in a culture that is pristine, not a piece of trash in sight. Is their behavior going to be the same? Right. And the
No.
answer, of course, is that no, it's not. Because although they had the same exact rule, the same exact handbook, their culture is communicating something that doesn't need to be said out loud, right? The culture is telling them this is how we do things around here. In the first culture, we litter. In the second culture, we don't, regardless of what the rules say, right? So that's kind of the importance of understanding this difference between culture and the employee handbook. It's also important to distinguish culture from strategy, right? I like to say that strategies are kind of like diets, right? There are different type of diets for different type of goals. If you want to get healthier, maybe you go on, a very kind of vegetable heavy diet. If you want to be, if you're a power lifter, you might be like on a high carb, high protein diet. If you're trying to lose weight, maybe you go on like a pescatarian diet. But the point is that you have a goal and that diet is designed for that goal. That's what strategies are, right? Strategies are designed to achieve specific things. Culture is like a complete lifestyle, right? It's more holistic, right? A culture is not something that changes based on goals, based on kind of the goal of the hour. Culture is something that sustains. It is reflective of what we care about, regardless of what our goals are, right? And it's really important to understand that. And so culture is something that we can go in for a long time, but it's really, really powerful when it comes to like driving behaviors and driving the way people interact. When you talk about like what creates a good culture, there's a lot of things that contribute to a good culture. But I'll give one particular example that I think is really, really interesting because you mentioned things like engagement and motivation. A lot of companies struggle with disengaged employees, lack of motivation. As a matter of fact, there was a poll, I think it was a Gallup poll, that found that like $500 million, so $500 million is lost in the US every year just based on disengagement from employees, right? It's a very tangible thing. how do we create engaged employees? Well, again, there's a number of ways we can do this. One of my favorite things from, again, the academic literature, because that's what I do, right? Is I bring these things to people who don't really have access to it or don't know how to get to it, is a concept known as job crafting. Okay. So job crafting, what we know is we know one of the things that creates disengagement, one of the primary drivers of disengagement is a lack of control, right? Feeling like I don't have any control over my job, over my day-to-day life within my job, right? I don't have any autonomy. And autonomy is really, really important for people. It's very, very important to feel like you have some measure of control. Job crafting is this technique that's been developed to help people help employees regain a sense of control, and therefore to also contribute to kind of reducing disengagement. What job crafting involves is it involves giving employees the freedom to rethink how they do their job, when they do their job, with whom they do their job, right? Who they work with to get their job done. Now, when I teach job crafting, when I introduce it to kind of corporate clients, you always get some especially more old school, leaders who are like, listen, this is never going to work. I want to first of all kind of assuage their fears, right? They can't come in and say, "Hey, listen, I am now the chief party officer. I'm going to work from 12:45 to 1 every day, and I'm going to do it from the Bahamas," right? There are limitations here. As the leader, you still get to tell them X needs to be done every day, Y needs to be done every month, Z needs to be done, every 6 months, right? You still set the parameters of like the must-haves. But what you do is you give them the freedom to kind of reimagine their role and kind of recraft their role within those parameters, right? Now, sometimes this can be as simple as, again, as I mentioned, like who I work with to get things done, right? If I have, X tasks to do, and it says, traditionally that I should be working with these people, but I prefer to work with these people to get done, I think can get done better. I now have the freedom to make that decision. What's really fascinating about job crafting is we find in the literature that not only does it reduce disengagement significantly, it increases collaboration. So people, when given the opportunity to job craft, they don't become more insular. They actually go and break down silos in an organization and make the organization better connected. But even more interesting is we found this research I'm quoting is from MIT, by the way, right? They found that organizations who engaged in job crafting saw 29% less turnover than organizations who didn't. And the reason is really, really interesting. Basically, what they found is that organizations that introduced job crafting, right? The employees saw this as a signal that, like, hey, this is an organization that is going to try to kind of find the right fit for you. And so, this signal, what it communicated to individuals is that if I'm unhappy, rather than immediately going and seeking out a new role, they became more likely to go to management and try to have a conversation with them about, like, hey, can we create something that works better for me? By doing that, they were able to reduce turnover by 29%, which is an absolutely massive number. And so there's little insights like that that are kind of hidden in the academic literature about how we can reduce disengagement without spending a dime.
Huh. I've kind of done that at my own day job by
Oh, nice.
accident without knowing what the term was. So the kind of the team that I help manage,
Yeah.
they always come, hey, I want to work on this other project
Yeah.
instead. No problem. I want to try this other thing. No problem. And we've had a super good group. Like, yeah. Oh, that's
That's
cool. Um, Kind of last question, and this is more of a maybe down a rabbit hole, but using the
Let's
10
do
people
it.
the 10 people and the litter example.
Yeah.
Um, the group that goes into the place that has a lot of litter,
Yeah.
if they were principled enough to then pick up the trash, like how do you get to that?
It's a really interesting question, right? You would really have to be hiring some stellar employees, right? To be individuals who would basically, because if we were to extend this back into kind of this analogy I was using between the employee handbook and the culture, right? These are employees who are coming in, reading the employee handbook, reading it as if it were kind of a religious text, right? And saying
Hmm.
like, this is how things need to be done, and then trying to go and change the culture. Those are very, very rare. Now, if in a hypothetical situation, you got those individuals who did that, right? You can shift a culture for sure. You can shift a culture, but it takes a lot of effort and consistency to be able to do that. And more than that, it takes employees who are willing to go against the culture at the beginning to achieve that. And that's a very hard thing to do. Human beings are wired to conform to the group, right? The reason that these kind of cultural signals are so powerful is because we have a tendency as human beings towards what we call social norm adherence, right? We tend to look around, and especially when we don't know what the right thing to do is, we look to others, right? What are others doing? Because not only is it informative, but there's safety in it, right? If everyone else is doing it, then it must at least be a safe thing for me to be doing as well. And so to kind of go against that as an employee would take an exceptional employee. It's not to say that it's out of the realm of possibility, but you would really need to be hiring a few individuals that were incredibly committed to kind of doing things by the book, literally and figuratively, in order to kind of create that type of culture change.
That would almost be a leadership type thing where you've got maybe a big company and
Hmm.
leadership is like, okay, culture has kind of gone down the tube. Let's go
Yeah,
find somebody who can help us. Yeah,
absolutely.
okay. That makes sense. All right, I know we only got a few minutes left. One anecdote for the people listening. If that California policy, if I got it wrong in some way, shape, or form, I'm gonna go research it right now to make sure I got it at least mostly right. If you see a little note in the description, that'll be the correction. Otherwise, I got it mostly right. I don't know.
It's
Um,
it was a good thought experiment at the very
yeah,
least. So,
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, 100%.
yeah.
Do you have any kind of, well, I guess we'll do this. Any kind of last thoughts, Nichols, before we get you out of here?
I'll give uh I'll give one more kind of little insight that I think people will find useful. It's probably my favorite thing to teach people about. And you referenced it a few times, right? This idea of framing. Um, Language is incredibly powerful, especially when you're trying to change someone's mind, if you're trying to kind of shift the way they see things or, alter their perspective. Language plays a hugely important role in that, right? And framing is one of my favorite tools to equip, especially leaders with, right? Now, for those who are listening and don't kind of understand framing effects, right? The example I give is imagine that you were walking through a grocery store, right? And you're in the mood for some frozen yogurt. And you go to the first aisle and you see the first option, and it says frozen yogurt, 80% fat free. And you think, okay, that sounds pretty good, but I want to kind of see what the other options are. So you go further down the aisle, you come upon option two. It says frozen yogurt contains 20% fat. Which one sounds more appealing? Now, of course, we're both smart people, right? We realize very quickly that these are the same exact things, but this is the essence of framing, right? Framing effects are kind of taking the same exact data, presenting it in slightly different ways, and eliciting very different reactions from people, right? Now, if humans were perfectly logical decision makers, framing wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter whether you say something is 80% fat free or 20% fat because we'd say those are exactly the same things. But that's not how people work. Framing is really, really powerful, right? We have, maybe another time, we can talk about this, right? But we have really fascinating research where, like, working physicians, made very different recommendations on whether someone should get surgery, depending on whether the surgery was framed as being 90% chance of survival or a 10% chance of mortality, right? Same exact things, but physicians were making very different decisions based on how it was framed. We have data to show that judges and juries make different decisions about things like sentencing based upon whether data is framed as percentages or frequencies, right? 10% of people like this person are going to go out and commit a crime versus 10 out of 100 people like this person are going to go commit a crime. Those are statistically equivalent, but they make very different decisions based on which one is presented. The most interesting one, in my opinion, is metaphors, right? The metaphors we use influence how people think about topics, and more importantly, how they choose to solve them. Right? So there's research by Thibodeau and Boroditsky back in 2011. Basically, what they did is they gave people vignettes about crime, and they either described crime as a beast attacking a city or a virus infecting a city. And they asked people, what should we do about crime? Naturally, if you're given the beast metaphor, you say, well, what would I do about a beast, right? I want to cage it, I want to capture it, I want to punish it. If you were given the virus metaphor and you're asked, what should we do about crime? You intuitively think, well, what would I do about a virus? I want to protect people from it. I want to inoculate it, right? I want to keep it from spreading. And when they asked these individuals what to do about crime, the ones that were given the beast metaphor became more likely to recommend enforcement strategies. We need more cops on the street. We need harsher penalties for criminals. The ones who were given the virus metaphor became more likely to recommend social reform strategies, right? We need to protect our communities from whatever is causing crime to spread. The point being, it's the same exact issue, but based on the metaphor you use, the way you frame it from a metaphoric standpoint, you can have a very different impact about how people think about and go to solve that thing. So framing, probably my favorite thing to talk about. I literally have full courses on framing, but wanted to make sure I leave your listeners with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell the people if they're interested in learning more about you or your company where they should go to look for it.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So best place would be the website Influence 51. That's influence51.com. That is absolutely the best place to go. But if you want to find me on LinkedIn, I'm admittedly not as active. I'm trying to be better. But you can look up the company on LinkedIn, or you can look up myself, JonRobert Tartaglione, on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with you there.
Awesome, awesome. For those listening, links will be in the description as always. Tat, really appreciate your time. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, me too.
Um, and uh, and for those listening, thank you again, and we will see you guys next time. Peace.
Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.